Welcome to the DataWise final presentation for Group 1 for Spring 2015 semester. Claire, Lena, Dana, Gabriella, and Lauren. We started our DataWise project by looking at the results from a 5th grade ELA assessment that was given after the first quarter of the instructional year. The assessment was made up of 3 reading selections with 27 multiple choice questions, and each reading selection had 9 multiple choice questions associated with it. And it also had 2 open response items, which were also associated with reading selections. For the purpose of the data overview, an item analysis was run on the multiple choice test items in order to identify trends in the performance of the 2 grade 5 classes. And we also assessed 6 writing samples, 4 short response and 2 medium response to help identify trends in student knowledge. We thought it would be useful to start by breaking down the questions and seeing of the strands that were tested, which were tested the most frequently and which were tested the least frequently. The strands tested were vocabulary, parts of speech, identify details, sequence details, main idea, analyze details, character traits, author's purpose, style and language, and genre. And we found that the strands were not tested equally. The most tested strands were identify details, which had 5 questions associated with it, character traits, which had 4, main idea, analyze details, vocabulary, and author's purpose, which each had 3. And the least tested strands were genre, parts of speech, sequence details, and style and language, which each had 1 or 2 questions associated with them. And we tried to take this into account when we looked at the breakdown of the questions by strand, because the the strands that were tested more, obviously, the averages were swayed by the number of questions in the strand. So we thought that would be useful to look at so that we could also think about what the state was really expecting students to know. The next thing we did was look to see where students were succeeding or struggling, and we found that in this assessment there wasn't a ton of consistency between the 2 classes, but we did recognize that they struggled the most with main idea, identifying details, and analyzing details, and this information really helped when we were looking to identify our learner-centered problem. We also noticed that students struggled with the content of some of the texts, and they appeared to struggle with The World's First Superstar, which was a nonfiction and historical text, and The Cave, which was realistic fiction and historical fiction. And we thought that this might be a problem with relating to history, and this meant that there might need to be a tie-in with social studies instruction when teaching literacy. And students answered questions related to the text Frindle with the highest degree of accuracy, and it was an engaging text that was easy for 5th graders to relate to. And it was also at the beginning of the assessment, which means that students were just starting and were probably full of energy and really focused. The Cave required a really different mindset from the students than Frindle did, and it was also towards the end of the test where energy levels might be starting to fade a little bit, and it also required them to take a step back in time to a world that's very different from the world they live in now, and this might have had something to do with why they struggled so much with answering questions in relation to that text. The next thing we did was break the data down by strand. So we looked at how many questions were answered correctly and incorrectly in relation to each skill area. And we placed Class A and Class B next to each other for comparison's sake. And we also placed the grade average on the graph so that teachers could look at it to have an idea of how the 5th grade did as a whole, in relation to other schools in the district as well as other schools in the state. And we identified that the strands that students struggled with the most were identifying details, analyzing details, and main idea. Although, as you can see on the graph, students also struggled with parts of speech and genre, although each of these strands only had 1 or 2 questions associated with it, and we felt like that really had an impact on the data. The least successful strands, as I said, were main idea, identifying details, and analyzing details. And as you can see, students were pretty consistent in the 2 classes in these strands, except for main idea, in which Class A struggled a little bit more than Class B did. And paired with the item analysis and the written responses, this information helped us to develop our learner-centered problem. Due to the variation in student performance within the least successful strands, it was useful to closely examine individual questions that were particularly puzzling. And this is just a screenshot of what that process looked like. So this involved analyzing the subskills addressed by each question, noting which students responded incorrectly and how those students performed on the assessment overall, identifying common incorrect answers, and reaching a hypothesis about why students selected each incorrect response. And this item analysis provided really valuable information that was essential in identifying the learner-centered problem. We chose 4 questions to analyze closely. 3 of the questions were questions that students struggled with across the board, and 1 question, question 5, we chose because there was such a big difference in the responses between Class A and Class B. The questions came from 3 different strands. Analyzing details and drawing conclusions, that was questions 5 and 22. Identifying details was question 6. And sequencing details was question 24. We thought the most important thing about analyzing these questions was trying to get to the root of why students selected an incorrect answer. We found that students struggled with 2 main areas, and as we said before, we thought that it might have something to do with the genre of the text and also at what point of the assessment the item was located. Because obviously at the beginning of the assessment, students had a lot of energy, and after they've been reading and answering questions, that energy starts to fade. 3 of the questions that the students struggled with were based on the selections at the end of the text and that were either historical fiction or nonfiction. Question 22, which came from the analyzing details strand, was missed by 24 out of the 32 students tested. Question 24, sequencing details, was answered incorrectly by 23 out of 32 students, and question 26 from the identifying details strand was missed by 22 out of 32 students. We did also want to note that Class A had 18 students and Class B only had 14 students, which could account for some of the differences that we saw in scores in the strands. But each class demonstrated a lot of difficulty with both the nonfiction and the historical fiction text. For the questions from the cave, the amount of students answering correctly were equal in Class A and Class B, 12 in Class A and 11 in Class B. And question 24 had each class with 11 students providing an incorrect response. We also analyzed 6 writing samples, which were scored based on rubrics. 4 of them were short response questions and 2 were medium response questions. The short response questions were scored on the New York State 2-point rubric, and of the 4 short response questions, there was 1 0, 2 1s, and 1 2, which shows that students were struggling with the writing section of the assessment. And the most common reasons for missing points were that students provided inaccurate or not enough supporting evidence. And the directions were very clear in that students needed to use 2 supporting details from the text, and only 1 response used 2 details accurately. The medium response questions were scored on the New York State 4-point rubric, and students were graded in different areas, which were content and analysis, command of evidence, coherence, organization and style, and controls of convention. And this rubric was useful to look at because it gave us an idea of what was expected of students on the assessment. and they were scored in all of those areas and then were given an overall score. So one student received a 1 and one student received a 2, which again shows that students really struggled with the writing portion of the assessment. Students seem to struggle with analyzing details and using that information to support their answers. And in both of the medium responses, it was unclear whether or not the student understood the question because their answers did not clearly address what was being asked. And that information, paired with the information from our item analysis and the breakdown of the strands, helped to inform our learner-centered problem, which stated that students were struggling with identifying and analyzing details and using them to support the main idea.